Welcome, everyone. I'm Ashanti Edwards, the Director for Professional Development at the American Society for Cell Biology. We are pleased to offer this webinar series as part of LSC and ASCB's Professional Development webinar. Today, our moderator will be Damani White-Lewis, and he will be introducing our featured author. Damani?
Hello, everybody, and thank you for that fantastic introduction. Good afternoon or good morning from wherever you're coming from. My name is Damani White-Lewis, and I'm an assistant professor at the University of Pennsylvania. I'm very happy to welcome everybody here to this online LSC webinar, which I'll be moderating today. Just to remind everybody in the audience, the goal of this webinar series is to be a virtual journal club to provide some behind-the-scenes insights into biology education studies. I'd also like to strongly encourage everyone to submit questions as we go along. That's what really makes the conversations flow. So please make active use of the Q&A feature to submit your questions, and we'll synthesize those questions and make them visible as we go. So with that said, it is my pleasure to introduce today's featured author, Dr. Elizabeth Barnes. Dr. Barnes is an assistant professor at Middle Tennessee State University in the Department of Biology. She was trained as a discipline-based education researcher with a focus in biology education. She's most interested in studying social perceptions of science and how principles from social psychology can help us understand and mitigate negative attitudes towards science. As a National Science Foundation Graduate Research Fellow, she earned her PhD in biology from Arizona State University, studying how to reduce tension between religion and evolution. She now runs the Social Perceptions of Science Lab at Middle Tennessee State University. So without further ado, Dr. Barnes.
Thank you so much for that introduction. And hi everyone here. Thanks for being here and taking time out of your day to come and listen to me talk about this work, and everyone from LSE Online who invited me to come talk to you today. So I'm really excited to tell you about some of the work that me and my collaborators have done on community college student understanding and perceptions of evolution. But the conception of this paper is a little different from most and kind of begins more with my broader interests in how to study and teach evolution effectively as a culturally controversial science topic. So these, what I call culturally controversial science topics, are topics that are really important in science, but are some of the most controversial in society. So for instance, I've done work in the areas of evolution, climate change, and vaccines. And these are areas where we have broad scientific consensus, but significant public disagreement. And I've specifically done a lot of work on evolution education because evolution is a really great case study for how valid scientific information can be rejected over long periods of time. So for instance, even though evolution is a core concept of biology for at least 30 years, but probably since Darwin first published The Origin of Species, around half of the American public has not accepted at least human evolution. But what's even more surprising is that even modernly, my research is showing that among introductory biology students, about 35% of them don't think that life shares a common ancestor. So why is this happening? Why is it that so many people reject such a well-supported scientific proposition? Well, one thing I hear from instructors and biologists a lot is that they think that people just don't understand enough about evolution, right? So they think if we just were able to help our students understand evolution better and get an A on that evolution exam, that this will help them accept evolution. But the research is really mixed on that, right? So among some populations, understanding of evolution is really predictive of how much somebody will think evolution is true. But among others, it's not. So we actually have people who understand evolution really well, but don't necessarily accept it. And this is particularly found among highly religious populations, and religiosity is consistently in the literature one of the strongest predictors of evolution acceptance, but it's not the strongest predictor because there are many religious people who still accept evolution. So what our current research is showing is that it really comes down to the extent to which somebody thinks that their religion conflicts with evolution, right? And this was a paper that we recently published in CBELSE that showed that this extent of perceived conflict is the most predictive factor for evolution acceptance among undergraduate biology students. So I've spent a lot of time thinking about how we can try to reduce this perceived conflict between religion and evolution. And we've advocated for using a lens of cultural competence. And this is a framework that we came up with that has a list of instructional practices that have shown some kind of evidence for reducing perceived conflict between religion and evolution. And this can help biology instructors who are mostly secular. Actually, research shows that 75% of biology instructors don't affiliate with a religion, whereas most of their students do. So this lens of cultural competence can help mostly non-religious instructors try to reduce perceived conflict among religious students. And I don't have a lot of time to go into these specific practices, but I thought it was important to bring up this framework because it was really studying this framework that led to the data collection for the community college evolution perceptions paper that I'm talking about today. So we advocated for using this lens, and we actually received NSF funding to study religious cultural competence in evolution education on a nationwide level. So we ended up collecting a bunch of data from introductory college biology students across the nation in a whole bunch of states, measuring, right when they're coming into college, what are things like their evolution acceptance, their evolution understanding, their perceived conflict with their religion and evolution, as well as things like their interest in evolution and religious and demographic factors that might influence some of these evolution education variables. And through this project, we're able to test whether instructors using those practices have better outcomes, because then we survey students after instruction. But we collected so much data for this project. So there's 11,995 students in that pre-survey data set that it led to us actually publishing a bunch of papers that we didn't expect to when we first set out to complete this project. So for instance, in collaboration with Jamie Jensen and Sarah Brownell, who are on the panel today, we were able to compare online and in-person religious cultural competence because of the transition to online instruction during the COVID-19 pandemic. And we were also able to start looking at some small groups of students that aren't usually large enough of a population to look at statistically. So for instance, we published a paper on Muslim undergraduate biology student evolution acceptance. And it was right around this time that CBE LSE put out a call for papers on community college students. And I thought this was a really great idea. I had been really well aware of the fact that we needed more studies among community college students. And I immediately realized that we likely had some data on community college student evolution perceptions from this large nationwide collection that we could look at for this issue. So we did a literature review to find all the papers that had looked at community college student evolution perceptions. And we found that there were really only a handful of studies that had examined the variables that we explored in our data set. So there are at least 100 studies on undergraduate biology evolution education, but almost all of them were among university students. And this was concerning because we know community college students can be different from university student populations. So they're more diverse in terms of age, race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, and even religion, which are all factors that have been shown previously to be related to students' evolution perceptions. So that meant that we could answer some research questions that there was a gap in the literature for that could have implications for community college students. So first, what are community college student levels of all of these different variables that we measured in our data set and compared to university students? So we can start to see, is this broad literature base in university evolution education somewhat generalizable to the community college the community college students that we were studying? And then also, what is the relationship between evolution acceptance and understanding among community college students? Because like I said, that relationship in prior literature has been variable across studies, and nobody has looked at that among community college students. And this could have implications for, for instance, the need for using religious cultural competence. So we looked at our data set and we identified a set of classes in Arizona and California for which we had both community college and university student data in the same geographic region. So not just in the same state, but they were in the same geographic regions of each state. And this mattered a lot for studying comparisons because geographic region is highly correlated with like religious culture and is a big determinant of evolution acceptance. So we really only wanted to have universities and community college that were in the same region. And what was really great about these particular universities and community colleges is that they both had what they call transfer agreements. So meaning that the introductory community college courses are seen as equivalent to the university introductory courses. So we culled our data to only include the students from universities and community colleges in these two geographic regions in Arizona and California. And this is a demographic table of our sample broken down by community college students and university students. So stars next to a category means that they were statistically different between the two populations. And we found, just as expected from prior literature, that the makeup of these two student populations were different in terms of race, ethnicity, and parent education levels, which is a correlate of socioeconomic status. And some of our prior studies and other prior studies associate these variables with differences in evolution perception. So for instance, we published a paper recently on Black and Hispanic student evolution acceptance and how lower levels of evolution acceptance in those populations can actually be explained by higher levels of religiosity within those communities. So we wanted to know, did these differences translate in evolution to evolution perception differences between these two populations? So to do that, we took our data and we ran linear regressions with all of those outcome variables in the model of evolution interest, understanding, acceptance, as well as perceived conflict. And then we included whether the student was at a community college as a predictor to see if these students' evolution perceptions were different from university students. And we included state and major in there because those are things that could influence the results that we wanted to control for. All right, so here are some of the results. So we found that in terms of evolution interest, community college had similar levels of interest. So these are violin plots. The shape of the violin represents the density of data at that point on the y-axis. The dashed line is the overall average of the data, which was mostly university students, right? So that kind of shows the average university student. And this black line in the middle is the average of the data for each group. These are an example item, so you can kind of get an idea of what these items were asking. And in terms of evolution interest, we could not find a statistically significant difference between the two populations. So community college students were just as interested as university students in evolution. However, when we looked at evolution understanding, we did see that community college students had a slightly lower understanding of evolution. It was about a 10 percentage point difference. And that star here represents when that's a statistically significant difference going forward. All right, so what about evolution acceptance? So we actually measured evolution acceptance on 3 different scales. So microevolution acceptance, macroevolution acceptance, and human evolution acceptance, because these 3 areas represent different levels of acceptance that students have. So students tend to accept human evolution, for instance, much less than they accept microevolution. And what we found is that there were slight differences. So they're small, but for microevolution and human evolution acceptance, community college students were slightly less accepting of evolution. The difference with macroevolution acceptance did not reach statistical significance. All right, and in terms of perceived conflict between religion and evolution, we measured this on 4 different subcategories. So first, we looked at students' perceived conflict with their religious belief, right? But we also looked at their perceived conflict within their community. So how much conflict do they see within their community about religion and evolution? And on both of these measures, we were able to see a statistically significant difference with community college students perceiving more conflict between religion and evolution than university students. But we also measured students' perceived conflict with evolution and their religious teachings, as well as perceived conflict between their belief in God and evolution. And although the average of community college students was higher, it didn't reach statistical significance. So once again, we're seeing this theme of there's like a little bit of a difference in some areas, but it's small when we do see it. So then beyond just comparing like levels of these variables across students, we wanted to look to see if the relationships between various variables were different for these populations. So what we did is we selected only the community college students in our data set, and we wanted to see, is their evolution acceptance predicted by their evolution understanding as well as their religiosity level? So that's how religious someone sees themselves as being. And we once again controlled for state and major. And then we selected only university students and we ran the exact same models, and we wanted to see, would the coefficients for these predictor variables be different? And this is what the results look like. So first, I'm going to show you human evolution acceptance. And this is where I think some of the most interesting results of this paper lie. So like I said, in the evolution education literature, there's kind of an inconsistent relationship between evolution acceptance and understanding. And we see that happening in our data set here as well. So these are coefficients from linear regressions. This is the coefficient for evolution understanding. As you can see for university students, this is a large, significant coefficient, whereas with community college students, it is a smaller coefficient and is not statistically significant. So what that means is that how much a community college student, at least in this population, understands evolution is not really related to how much they accept evolution, human evolution. We saw the same thing for macro evolution acceptance. And the only time that we saw evolution understanding related to community college student acceptance was with micro evolution acceptance. So with micro evolution acceptance, we did see that that was still related to their evolution understanding, which makes sense because microevolution is an area where people don't really perceive much conflict between their religion and evolution, right? So if you don't have an identity conflict, then the understanding of evolution is much more likely to impact acceptance. Okay, so in summary, community college student evolution perceptions are really not that different from university students. We saw slightly lower evolution understanding and acceptance, slightly higher perceived conflict between religion and evolution, but those differences were really small. But factors related to evolution acceptance among community college students are different from university students. Understanding evolution did not relate to community college student evolution acceptance, but it did for university students. So what this indicated to us is that perhaps using that religious cultural competence and evolution education framework could be disproportionately beneficial to community college students if teaching them the facts and evidence about evolution might not be as effective for making them more comfortable with learning evolution. But obviously we need more research done to show that that's the case. Okay, and then I just want to thank the team that was on the paper. It wasn't just me that did this research. My former master's student, Rebecca Riley, my current MTSU research assistant, Chloe Bowen, were both on this paper, as well as we collaborated with a faculty member at Maricopa Community College, Jackie Kalla, and Sarah Burnell was my postdoc advisor when we collected this data. And then of course we have a panel that is here that has expertise in evolution education that I know that they are going to introduce now. So thank you for listening. I'm looking forward to a discussion.
Thanks so much, Dr. Barnes. And now I believe we're going to open it up for questions. But before we do that, I'm going to introduce our panel members. Okay. So first we have Dr. Jason Wiles. They are a biology professor at Syracuse University, where he holds appointments in science teaching and earth sciences. His research deals mainly with how people learn about and interact with science. Dr. Wiles focuses on issues related to evolutionary biology and climate change education, and on diversity, equity, and inclusion in STEM fields. Dr. Jamie Jensen is a professor of biology at Brigham Young University. She is a discipline-based education researcher who specializes in the reconciliation of science with religious faith. She earned her PhD from Arizona State University, studying collaborative group learning and the development of scientific reasoning skills, and a master's from Brigham Young University studying molecular evolution and brain development. And finally, we have Dr. Sarah Burnell, who is a professor of life sciences at Arizona State University. She's a neuroscientist turned full-time education researcher who teaches undergraduate biology while studying biology education. As a science faculty member with education specialty, she uses both qualitative and quantitative data to better understand how to create more inclusive undergraduate biology learning environments. And it looks like we already have some questions in the chat. So I have some pre-prepared questions, but we want to get to y'all's questions first. So those are just in case we need them. So the first question is, I would love to hear from the panel members how they perceive the importance of acceptance versus understanding of evolution as students move from lower division to upper division biology courses.
Who wants to take that one?
Yeah, how do we do this?
I think we've all done some work around acceptance versus understanding and what acceptance actually means, where we kind of tend to think of acceptance as being based on an evaluation of evidence rather than something like belief, which can kind of have these religious connotations. So I think understanding is really our goal. But in a lot of cases, understanding can be kind of conceptually blocked by a rejection of evolution. It's kind of hard to listen toward understanding if you're, worried about the implications religiously or for some aspect of your identity. So a lot of times what we're trying to get at with what Liz is talking about with cultural competence is understanding that for a lot of students, the rejection might stand in the way of their understanding and helping them to kind of resolve that conflict just to a point where they can think about the science behind it and the concepts that are involved. Not that we're trying to change anyone's religious beliefs in the context of a science class, but to think about what science is and how non-threatening science kind of positions itself in the realm of religious discussion.
Yeah, one thing to add on to that is education researchers often make a huge distinction between acceptance and belief, as Jason indicated, that acceptance is based on evidence in some way, but work that Liz and I have done indicates that students just don't view those words as different. So when you basically ask them, what does it mean to accept evolution versus what does it mean to believe evolution? They think about it the same way. And I think about it, with complicated science that I don't know anything about. I accept that it's true because scientists already accept that it's true. And I accept that because they accept that it's true, then I accept that. So I think that, the distinction that's often been made in the literature about the difference between belief and acceptance, I think is a false difference. And when we're actually talking about our students, whether we're talking about intro students or upper level students, I think that they are using belief and acceptance simultaneously or just in very similar ways. And so, to answer that question a little bit more, I think that we know that with intro students, some of them have never been exposed to evolution. So for them, it might be a gut reaction. I'm going to reject evolution because I don't know anything about it. And we have shown some evidence that for intro students, teaching them about some of the facts about evolution can help them because they just don't know anything about it. But there's still, as Jason and Jamie and Liz and some of my work has all shown, that you still have a bunch of students that you give them additional facts about evolution. It doesn't change their acceptance because of that underlying conflict.
And I think that also thinking about intro students versus advanced students, obviously our goal is for students to be scientifically literate. And part of that is that acceptance, right? Being able to look at data and say, yeah, this makes sense. But as you go into upper division, especially if you're going to go into medicine, for instance, we really want these students to not just understand the concepts and be able to regurgitate them on a test, but we want them to use evolution as an explanation that leads to appropriate predictions, appropriate hypotheses for research. And so I often get sort of, especially in religious audiences that I deal a lot with, I get kind of, they throw at me that, why do you care? We accept, as long as we understand it's fine. And I think, well, actually, if you don't accept it as a valid theory, then you're not going to use it in making important decisions. And so maybe for the intro student, maybe that's less of a distinction, but as you go into upper division biology, and if you're going to end up in a biology related field, I think it's really important that we accept this as a solid scientific theory so that we do the right research, we make the right predictions, we don't waste time on things that maybe don't matter.
Yeah, and just to add on to that a little bit, I think that like this idea that we want to have students be able to discern between like scientific theories that have robust evidence versus ones that don't, and be able to recognize when their own identities might be influencing the way that they're seeing the science. I mean, we see this pattern with all sorts of other topics that we all generally care about a lot, like climate change and vaccines. And so this idea of teaching students like where identities might rub up against these topics and how to like catch themselves, I think is going to become increasingly like a core important part of teaching scientific literacy.
Fantastic answers all around. Y'all are good. We have a star-studded panel here today. So the next question is a 2-for-1. I'll read them both out and then folks can decide how they want to approach it. First, is understanding evolution a yes/no question, or do students retain confusions about the processes involved? And second, what if there are real conflicts between the scientific theory of evolution and religious beliefs? Can they in fact be reconciled?
I'll go ahead and tackle this first. So absolutely, it's not a yes/no question. So there's different just like any concept in science or in biology, you're going to understand some things and not understand other things, right? And I think our ultimate goal is that students, as they move through the curriculum, that they understand more things, right? They're going to have misconceptions. Hopefully, we can counteract some of those misconceptions. So it's not simple. So everything that we're saying today here in terms of student understanding of evolution and student acceptance of evolution, there's gradations there, right? And I think it's something really important to realize that actually the vast majority of students, as well as people in society, accept microevolution, and it's macroevolution and it's human evolution that tends to be where there's the most conflict there. And obviously with understanding of evolution, it's the same idea. Students could understand more simple ideas, but as they get into more nuances, they're going to struggle with some of that understanding. As far as your second question, absolutely, there are real conflicts between scientific theory of evolution and religious belief. And something I think that's super important is that when we talk about perceived conflict, it's highlighting that there are areas where there isn't necessarily conflict between religion and evolution, but there are for sure some areas where there are conflict. If people take an incredibly literal interpretation of a biblical text, then it's going to be in conflict with what we know to be true as far as evolution. So it's certainly not saying that all religious beliefs and every single kind of religious doctrine is completely compatible with evolution, but it's opening up the conversation to highlight that for a lot of religions and a lot of religious beliefs, there is room to have both religious faith and acceptance of evolution. I'll pass it over maybe to Jamie to piggyback off of that.
Yeah, so I think you've covered number one. I think that's a pretty sure thing, that there's variation in acceptance or in understanding. As far as non-reconciling, you're absolutely right. There are things that cannot be reconciled in a way that's maybe fully compatible with the science. But it's important to remember that, just like any cultural competent practice, we're trying to invite them to the table. Right. So there are people who are, in fact, not going to be able to let go of certain beliefs, especially if they literally interpret the Bible. But it doesn't mean they can't at least understand the principles of microevolution. And maybe that's as far as we get. And maybe most of the decisions they're going to make in their lives, that's going to be sufficient. And so, again, like I think it was Jason who said at the beginning, we're not out to necessarily change religious belief. And that's a tricky thing, because sometimes if it's in direct conflict, we say, well, we really need to change that. We really need to destroy that belief. But that's not necessarily our goal. Our goal is just to get them to the point where they can be productive members of society, where they can make good decisions about science and understand where this plays a role in their life. And I think also importantly is understanding the nature of science and what questions science can answer and what questions science can't answer. I think that's a really important one that often, even when we have these really distinct conflicts, that understanding can help them make a lot of progress. And I see Jason shaking his head. Maybe you can add on to that.
Yeah, I mean, I can actually approach both of these questions from a very personal perspective. I was at one time a young Earth creationist. I grew up in rural Arkansas and was taught mostly that evolution was something to really be afraid of, and that people teaching it were probably trying to lead me astray from my faith. It took a long time to make that pilgrimage toward understanding and accepting evolution. And yeah, it wasn't like an immediate thing. There were gradual changes, and the same is true of the students that I've studied from Arkansas and elsewhere, where they come to accept evolution by kind of accepting pieces here and there or adding new things to their mental models. And you kind of have this situation where you view the world in some particular way based upon the experience you've had, the things you've been taught by people you trust and love. And then as you learn more things that kind of don't fit with that model, then you kind of leave that to the side and let it kind of play with your model as it is. And then when there's kind of a critical mass of counter evidence, you really are forced to confront that cognitive dissonance. And it doesn't need to be traumatizing, as it was for me in a lot of ways. When you have people like instructors like Liz and Sarah and Jamie who use that frame of cultural competence, or like Jamie in particular, who works at BYU and serves students who are primarily LDS or CJC students, they will have this kind of person who they know shares their faith and have that comfortability to work within that toward something like a reconciliation, which is kind of variable depending on what religious background they're coming from and what the not just scientific or religious, but cultural and kind of social ramifications that may have for their lives and relationships.
Great answers. I'm going to go in. Oh, Liz, were you going to say something?
I'll just add on really quickly. Those were all great answers. And I just think that overall, like, students see the conflict highlighted a lot more disproportionately than what the actual conflict is. So even though there's real conflict, it's actually just in two pretty kind of narrow areas in literal interpretations of biblical text. But what they don't see is all the examples of potential compatibility. The religious scientist role models, they're not taught how evolution is actually technically agnostic rather than atheistic. And so highlighting that more, because we already know from the research that they see examples of conflict enough, I think is part of the heart of this as well.
Great. So I'm going to get to John's question next, but I see a comment at the bottom that is a sort of addendum to question number 2. I see some smiles, so I'm curious as to what y'all think. The question is, has Francis Collins been asked number 2? How would he answer it?
So I don't know if he's been asked directly number 2 from Mike, but he wrote The Language of God, which is a book highlighting, biologos, or his idea of theistic kind of evolution, being able to reconcile both, Christian belief and evolution. And so I would argue that he would say that that there are a lot of areas of potential compatibility. In the book, The Language of God, he highlights some of the concerns that folks have. So we often think about evolution as something that's happening randomly, and many religious doctrines provide the opportunity for miracles to happen. He actually talks about, what might miracles be, and they might be statistical anomalies. And I think, he makes fairly good arguments that that there's a lot that we don't know in terms of science, right? And that we have to take an agnostic view in terms of whether or not there is a God, or to the extent to which evolution is God's process. And so I think that that's how he would answer that question. I don't know, pushing it off to Liz, if you have other thoughts.
I think you summed that up nicely.
I will say that the subtitle to the book that Sarah was talking about was "A Scientist Presents Evidence, regarding their faith." But if you actually talk to Francis Collins, he will say that that evidence for God and the relationship that he sees there doesn't come from science, but rather from relationships of people and from his religion in particular. But that the science will show a story very much in line with what we see told through the idea of natural selection and evolutionary history of relationships between those organisms. So I think that the book that we're talking about here, The Language of God, is an attempt to reconcile a scientific view that shows that evolution is real and something that we have to understand in order to perform good science, with a religion that is an active faith in terms of how we deal with ourselves in relationship to each other.
Great. So I misspoke earlier. There was a question right before John's, then John's. This question comes from Gina. And it is, if perceptions of conflict don't differ that much between these two groups of students, but the relationship between knowledge and acceptance does differ, which is super interesting, do you think that conflict likely does not explain much of that difference, or cold small amounts of conflict differences have out impacts on this relationship? To say it another way, I'm curious whether you think that perceptions of conflict impacts the relationship between evolution knowledge and evolution acceptance.
That is an excellent question, and I think a super interesting one that I really, really wish we could have explored with these data. But our perception of conflict measure was a measure that was only valid for religious students, so students who affiliated with a religion, right? So that means that any analyses that we did that had perceived conflict in it about cut our sample size in half. And what that did is it made it unable for us to actually put perceived conflict with religion and evolution in our regression models and to test any kind of like moderation or mediation effects with that. But I agree. I think that's super interesting. And I'd love for us to have like a bigger sample to be able to do something like that in the future.
Interesting. Can I just throw out there, a lot of the research data that we've been collecting recently has shown that those who perceive conflict between religion and evolution are actually non-religious populations. They actually perceive more conflict than our religious populations, is what we're seeing. Now, we haven't published this yet, but I think that's what we're seeing. And so I wonder, the P-Core, did you give it to the non-religious students, or did they skip those questions? Did you have skip logic in there, or do we have those data?
Yeah, so that it's a skip logic, right? So you ask, they indicate their religious affiliation. If they say they don't have one, then they don't get the perceived conflict scale. Only the religious students do. Now, we do have some data using a scale that we created that could measure perceived conflict among all individuals. So this is how much conflict do you see between religion and evolution broadly, right? So like an example item is something like the religion and evolution can be compatible, right? And we can ask that of atheist individuals, right? We can't ask atheist individuals, do your religious beliefs make it harder to accept that humans evolved from apes? So we have that data. We are currently working on it. We're analyzing those data. We're not ready to share them yet, but we're seeing surprising findings in our data as well.
Great answers. Okay, now John. John says, thank you for the talk. I'm curious about your data collection procedures and how you went about collaborating with community colleges. Did you already have connections, or did you create them for the study? And did you create your materials in collaboration with the community college instructors or beforehand?
Yeah, so that's a good question. And it's kind of a mixture of a couple things. So first, we recruited broadly through listservs on the Society for Advancement of Biology Education Research listserv. And we got a whole bunch of people who were interested in participating in the study that way. And I think that's how we ended up recruiting a couple of community college instructors. However, we also had personal connections in Arizona in the Maricopa Community College system. So for instance, I was a student at Maricopa Community College for 4 years. So I reached out to some of those old instructors that I knew. But I also emailed all the instructors at those community colleges, and some of them were willing to participate. So that's how we got those instructors.
I think one additional thing to add on to this, and I think this is an unfortunate complication having to do with collecting data at community colleges. When we've tried to reach out to certain community colleges, they've completely shut down our requests for any kind of data collection because they just have policies that they don't feel like they want to collect data in any kind of class. So there are, and I don't think this is necessarily true of it's certainly not true of all community colleges, but it's just dependent on the community college. And I think that there are probably fewer of those blanket policies in place at more research institutions that are more comfortable kind of collecting data. So I think that this is a broader issue beyond this study, but all studies in thinking about some of the complications of collecting data at community colleges if the institution just says, nope, we're not comfortable with any kind of data collection happening in any class.
Or
We
the
had that same
IRB.
issue with,
Oh, go ahead.
oh
Go
yes,
ahead,
I was just going to say the exact same thing, right? We've
Mhm.
had the similar issues with community colleges where they don't even have an IRB office. So they're just unfamiliar with the protocol. And I don't know how to fix that, but that if we want more data on community colleges, we need to get those in place.
And sometimes we're able to use IRBs at other institutions, even though the community college themselves don't have an IRB. Some community colleges have IRBs set up, right, specifically because they've seen the benefit of collecting these data, but some are just like, because we don't have this, we're just shutting it down. So I think that that's a complication with collecting these types of data.
Great. Regina Sullivan says, thank you for the presentation. There's such a void in the field around community college students' understanding of evolution. We have unpublished data that shows quite a bit of misunderstanding about the concept of common ancestry among community college students. For us, I do think it is more complicated than the religious considerations.
So that's where you may see that knowledge is a predictor, right? And we've seen this in the literature. Some populations knowledge is a huge predictor, other populations it's not. And so if they're coming in with just less foundation, which I think traditionally, a lot of community college students are non-traditional and they're coming in maybe with less of a background in science than others. And so there are other things involved. And I think that's where you'll see that knowledge can become a predictor of that acceptance.
It's also interesting that you brought up specifically the idea of common ancestry, because this is something that I think we see both a lot of controversy in with perceived conflict with religion, but also a lot of misunderstanding. So we've done some interviews with students on surveys that measure evolution acceptance and ask them like what they think certain things mean in these measures. And when they're asked about common ancestry, students who say they fully accept evolution, so they say, I 100% accept evolution, I buy all the evidence. When you ask them, do you think life shares a common ancestor? Like a lot of them don't know. And they'll even say no. They'll say, well, I don't think like trees share a common ancestor with like dogs, right? So I think that's a really ripe area of future research, is like exploring this idea of student acceptance and understanding of specifically the common ancestry of life on Earth. So thank you for bringing that up.
I mean, that highlights a different challenge when people accept things and don't understand things, right? If they're just accepting things blindly, right? Which goes back to the point that students are just using acceptance and belief, I think, interchangeably.
Gail asks if there are any specific examples of pedagogical approaches that you found more effective / powerful in helping students come to an acceptance of evolution.
So I can share a little bit about, if you're dealing with religious students, this reconciliation model that we've been using seems to work really well. And if you want samples of that, we actually do have a website where a lot of people from different religious affiliations have posted lesson plans that actually specifically step through the issues in those particular religions. And so I'd be happy to share that in the chat. You can check that out. And that seems to work really well. We've got a lot of data to show that it's increasing acceptance without decreasing religiosity.
Yeah, and one thing I hear a lot of instructors ask is like, what is something like simple that I can do that won't take a lot of time? And I think like one of the single most effective things that we can do is describe the nature of science and evolution as agnostic. rather than atheistic, and describing the different kinds of knowledge that science answers versus other realms of study. And through that, then you can do things like show examples of religious scientist role models, right? Like Francis Collins, somebody who has very much been an advocate for evolution, but also is a deeply religious person. And just making it clear that those things don't have to be in conflict, the religion and evolution.
Yeah, I want to kind of reinforce what Jamie and Liz have both said here, because they've both done excellent work that is easily accessible, that can help. And with what Liz was talking about, doesn't have to take that much time. Liz actually has a paper out there that indicates that maybe as little as 6 minutes of cultural competent, kind of precursor to teaching evolution can help to bring down some of that conflict expectation that students might have. And the work that Jamie has been doing with folks from different universities that have support from particular denominations is really, really great and well tailored from religious leaders and scientists representing different traditions to think about these in ways that you could use in those very specific contexts. So they've done some very good work on that. I would also kind of really like to reinforce this idea of nature of science being a very important part of it. Our students tend to think about the world in terms of what they've learned and the experiences that they've had. But when we start thinking about the nature of science and what does science do, how does science work, what questions can science answer, as students start to consider what questions are maybe best answered by science and what questions can't science even approach, they start to kind of change the way they answer their questions about the world, answering questions perhaps best left to science with science. And those questions that science can't necessarily approach, they might look to their religion or other aspects of their identity or ways of knowing to answer those very different questions. And that's what we've seen with our research here at Syracuse and other places, that students might change the kind of religiosity they may have, but sometimes as they come to accept evolution, they become more religious in other ways in terms of practice or different groups that they associate with. Just answering questions about the physical world and the natural world in a scientific way, and answering those more deeply personal, religious, philosophical questions with religion and other types of ways of knowing as they start to understand the difference between science and non-science.
Fantastic. And one audience member is asking, how can they become culturally competent in talking about the apparent conflict between evolution and religion? Mostly that language just makes me feel like I'm not trained to do it very well.
That's a great question. And that echoes some of the work that Liz and I have previously done when we've interviewed instructors, particularly instructors at secular institutions. And a lot of instructors don't talk about this in class, don't know how to address it because they just are uncomfortable with this. They haven't been trained how to do this. It probably hasn't happened in previous classes that they've been in. But when we've interviewed students, a lot of times students, because some of the most outspoken kind of advocates for evolution often are very much kind of atheists, like you might picture kind of Richard Dawkins as that stereotypical example. Students often have preconceived notions that biology instructors are going to be atheists and biology instructors are going to be anti-religious, right? And so we do know that the majority of instructors teaching at secular institutions, there is a cultural disconnect. A lot of them are going to be more agnostic or atheist compared to their student populations. But that doesn't mean that they're anti-religious, right? And so just highlighting to students, regardless of your own religious identity, that you do feel like there could be compatibility between religion and science, that we're not trying to get students to reject their religious beliefs when they come in the door, because frankly, that's asking them to do something that more than likely is not going to happen, that can be a really positive step forward, right? So just the very simple act of acknowledging that there are religious students in the class and that it is possible to be religious and to accept evolution. I think that small piece can be really important for students, and we know that if you don't say that, students are going to potentially assume that you are anti-religious. So just by saying that one thing that could take all of 10 seconds to do, that could actually help students. And that one step can be a way to make your class more culturally competent.
Yeah, and thank you, Sarah. That was a great summation of that. And it just goes in line with everything that we know about learning, right? The students don't come in as a blank slate. They come in with all sorts of conceptions about the conflict between religion and evolution. And this is something that's really popularized in the media and by like popular scientists, right? Who write entire books about like the conflict between religion and evolution. And that's what they see. So if you don't say anything, like Sarah said, it's not that you're avoiding the conflict. You're actually just letting it propagate, right? Because a lot of students already have that conception coming into the class.
And I think just emphasizing that it's just small word changes. Like I've talked, I do a lot of professional development for faculty on this very topic. And sometimes it's just the way you phrase things. And for instance, saying, so therefore evolution shows that everything evolved. And so God doesn't need to be involved. Like that second part of that sentence, just completely unnecessary, and that puts people off as soon as you say it. And so it's just checking yourself and your language and saying, am I saying anything that goes beyond the science? Because that kind of a statement is actually beyond the science. Science is agnostic. And so we don't say anything about belief. And so it's just being aware. And I think that most people are aware. And if you're just aware, you can do a pretty good job. We usually see the problem when people are sort of militantly atheist and are trying to, do little jabs here and there at religious people. And so it's really not, it is like Sarah said, it's pretty easy to just throw in a little bit of, hey, it's okay to be religious, because science doesn't touch that.
Great responses. So this is a question that's pre-prepared that I had for y'all. A new report from Columbia University's Community College Research Center found that in the 2015-2016 school year, 49% of all students who completed a bachelor's degree at a four-year institution had enrolled at a two-year public institution at some point prior to that in the previous 10 years. Yet despite this, we neglect the community college sector in so much of our research. Why do you think that is, and what can we do about it?
Yeah, I mean, I addressed this a little bit earlier in my in my comments. I think that there are structural challenges, right, with this. So anyone who has done a multi-institution national study knows that that it's really hard to enroll any study in your or any institution in your study, right? And so you often have to engage with each institution's IRB. So if an institution doesn't have an IRB, that's going to make the process that much harder, right? I think that there's also a challenge where if you're doing these multi-institution studies nationally, if you do it for a community college that has a much smaller sample size, that can be also challenging because maybe you can't even actually use that data depending on the types of analyses you're interested in. If you have to nest them within institution type, then you may not even have the sample size to be able to ask your question. So I think that those are just structural challenges with how the system is set up. I think another set of challenges is the fact that because community college faculty are not often doing research as part of their normal jobs, right? They're doing a lot of teaching and service, that asking them to do research on top of their normal jobs is asking them to do something additional. So then that's why you don't have that kind of doing research at your own institution, which tends to be a lot easier to do for all of us who do biology education research. It's way easier to do it at our own institutions. So then that requires partnerships, right? And so luckily there's organizations like CC Bio Insights that are trying to form more of those collaborations with biology education researchers across multiple institutions to get more community college faculty involved in research. but again, there's still the challenge of it's part of the job of faculty. Like Jason, Jamie, Liz, and I, we all get credit for doing that research, and community college faculty might not actually get credit for doing that research. So it's asking them to take on something additional. If someone asked me to take on like additional things, teach a whole nother course just to do it, right? That you can imagine that there's a barrier to that. So I think we need to think more creatively about connections. We need to think more creatively about how we can make sure the community college instructors can get credit for that. And maybe it actually goes back to rethinking what the promotion and tenure paradigm looks like at community colleges, right? So I think that there's challenges at an individual level, but I think the bigger challenge is structural at this point.
Mhm. And just to give some ideas of how you might mitigate some of those challenges in the current structure that we have. So I think two things that we did that helped to recruit community college instructors was we offered a stipend for them to participate. So if they don't have incentive in their job, we gave them some kind of incentive for their time. We also, I think even more importantly than the stipend, is that we offered to show them the results from their class and their students, right? So they were able to actually get some kind of formative feedback on their class based on the data. And I found that they really appreciated that and wanted to continue to participate in semesters afterwards because of those incentives.
And then I think the third thing to kind of add on to that, we were very intentional to have a community college faculty member be part of our research team. And we made sure to involve her in the beginning kind of stage in terms of thinking about what some of our questions were and how we were going to engage with community colleges to make sure that we since that we were at R1 institutions, making sure that we weren't making assumptions that were not true, to make sure that we were better aware of what was happening in community college settings. And so I think that it wasn't perfect, but I think that it allowed us, right? It would have been better to have even more involvement from more community college faculty, but at least it was a step in the right direction.
Fantastic. Not a question, but I want to make sure this gets attention. Regina says, great question. Community college research is key for equity. 50% of students begin at community colleges, which is needed to form a diverse scientific workforce. And that she's also at a community college, interested in this research and would love to collaborate. Another question that I had for y'all is, what findings surprised you the most?
I think that there were a couple things that surprised me, but the thing that surprised me the most was the fact that understanding wasn't related to acceptance in community college populations. We didn't a priori have that hypothesis. And so that just opens up a whole set of new questions to explore among community college students. Like, does that generalize to other community college populations, or was it just a fluke with what we saw in the population we looked at, right? But also, like, the differences between the university and community college students were really small. And I think that we kind of expected them to be bigger than they were, which tells us that maybe some of the literature on university students could be generalizable to community college students.
Fantastic. So we have 2 more minutes, and this is the last question. Anybody can answer, or if you just have some final parting thoughts for our audience, feel free to shoot that out too. But that question is, what does the future of this work look like? Where do you plan to go from here?
I have all kinds of ideas, right? Oh, sorry. Yeah, Liz and I had actually been talking about collaborations because we are looking a lot at like faculty development. Can we help community college faculty have the tools necessary to do these things? And then looking at how effective it is at the community college versus at the university level, where we're dealing with non-traditional students in a lot of cases.
Yeah, exactly. I think that looking more at kind of the details, I would love to collect some more qualitative data. I know we talked about that, Jamie, some qualitative data about like how community college students are experiencing like cultural competence instruction, so we can better understand the mechanisms. Like, quantitative data only tells us so much, and it's actually a very small amount. So I'd love to dig into that more. And then just see, is religious cultural competence as effective in community colleges as university students? I think those are some interesting next steps.
I think we're also really quite interested in how you even measure something like evolution acceptance. And we've kind of been in a partnership on trying to figure out, all of these existing tools for measuring evolution acceptance are, they're not equal, and they all have some kinds of things that we might want to look at in terms of how we evaluate them. So I think one of the big next steps is a bigger project into measuring evolution acceptance across different contexts. I think community colleges would be certainly a very important place to go for finding out how those measurements may perform differently, different contexts.
Sounds good. So Teresa and Ashanti, unless I'm mistaken, I believe that's the end of our time, unless there was another slide or something I wanted to show at the end, but just wanted to take this moment to thank everybody, Dr. Barnes, Dr. Jensen, Dr. Wiles, Dr. Brunel, for a fantastic presentation, fantastic Q&A discussions. Everybody's answers were so thoughtful, and I know the audience appreciated them. So I want to give everybody a little round of applause.
Thanks again for inviting us.
And thank Ashanti and LSC as well for putting this fantastic event on.
Thank you guys so much.